Hey guys, welcome back. So last time we looked at whether Spartans can be infected by the Flood. So today we're looking at something a little bit different, whether the Hunters can be infected. So why the Hunters? What makes them so different? Well, unlike humans, Hunters aren't a single being, rather a collection of hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of individual beings. Worms, to be exact. Now, this isn't exactly news to anybody who's well versed in Halo lore, but we're going to briefly cover it anyway. So, Hunters are comprised of tons of individual worms called Lekgolo, who work with one another by grouping together to form one larger being, an almost collective consciousness that gains increased intelligence and strength the more worms combine. The Hunters we see in the games are one of many different forms the Lekgolo can take. And contrary to what the games make you believe, the Hunters are actually one of the rarer forms. We saw them take a human form in Halo Nightfall, and in Halo Wars 2, the Banished found a way to manipulate them into various different forms, from huge hulking mega beasts to using them as caltrops to stop tanks. During the Forerunner Flood War, the Forerunners even tried to use the Lekgolo against the Flood, specifically worms from the Thano-Lekgolo colony, the one that we saw in Halo Nightfall. Sadly though, the colony were part of 1,000 plans that were tried and failed at stopping the Flood, and the Forerunners eventually buried them deep beneath Installation 04's surface for an unknown reason. We don't know why they buried them, when they could have just left them where they were, but there probably was a very valid reason. And after surviving the firing of the Halo array, the worms were left on the ring to reproduce for hundreds of thousands of years. Because the Hunters aren't an individual creature, they don't exactly have a centralized nervous system or brain. The individual Lekgolo worms form a neurological bond with each other when they combine to form a Hunter, but they don't create a centralized nervous system that one infection form could tap into and then infect the entire Hunter itself, and the same goes for all of the other Lekgolo formations too. That being said, it's not entirely impossible for any of the Lekgolo formations to be infected. Each individual Lekgolo worm does have a nervous system and all of the other internal organs and other things that are required for an infection form to infect them. This means that theoretically, if a Hunter was swarmed by infection forms, then each individual worm within the Hunter could be infected. But this would not be an easy job for the Flood. First off, considering the number of worms that are used to make a Hunter, the Flood are going to need a hell of a lot of infection forms to infect every single one of them. But then, at the first sign of one of the worms being infected, there's nothing that says that the other worms couldn't just sort of disconnect from the main body and leave the infected worm behind. They could then go on to form another Hunter, this time without the infected worm. Now, we don't know whether that's canon or not, that's just my general assumption of what would happen. However, all of this assumes that infection forms could even infect the worms. I mean, technically they could, but if they wanted to control the host they're infecting, they'd need to stay in contact with the spinal cord and the brain, and considering how big an infection form is compared to one of the worms, that might not be an easy job. They can't just bury themselves inside the worm like they do with a human or an elite. They'd have to sort of stay on top of it. This little conundrum is where the Flood Spores would come in. Now, for those unaware, Flood Spores are the most basic type of infection form. They're airborne and they're capable of infecting somebody simply via being inhaled. When they're inhaled by the host, they begin consuming their biomass and creating those typical Flood growths that we see when a human or an elite gets infected, except it just happens at a much slower rate. Now, this sounds weird, but we don't know for sure if Lekgolo worms breathe or not, as crazy as that sounds. But if they do breathe, and they do inhale, and they continue to do so when they form a Hunter, then it could actually be quite easy for all of the worms in a Hunter to become infected if they're somewhere like a Flood hive, where there's Flood spores everywhere. For example, High Charity. It might have even happened on High Charity. However, the downside to this is that the Flood can't control the bigger forms that the Lekgolo create, like the Hunter. So if all of the worms in a Hunter were infected, the Flood still couldn't control it. Instead, they'd just be controlling the individual worms. But all of this aside, if both spores and infection forms wouldn't work, there is still one final way for the Flood to utilize the Hunters: biomass. Each individual worm could be used as biomass and can be used like the body or flesh of any other species, to help form a Proto-Gravemind, or help create a Gravemind, or, God forbid, even a Keymind. So, can the hunters be infected by the Flood? Well, not exactly the hunters, but theoretically the Legolo, the individual hunter worms, can be, but we've never seen or heard of it happen before. I think it would be kinda cool to see this happen in the future. I've just got no idea how this could be implemented into the gameplay, considering the Flood can't control the larger formations like hunters, so we'd just be fighting individual worms, unless the Flood can make their own forms with them, of course. That's the only way to make this viable for gameplay, in my opinion. So, I don't know, it could be kinda cool. Let me know in the comments if you'd ever want to see this. If you enjoyed this video and you want to support me further, then check out my Patreon, the link is in the description. I want to give a big shout out to TheArdentPrayer, Chris G, Jack Cook, Jack Madden, and all of the other patrons for their continuous generous support. Thanks a lot for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.